This podcast is sponsored by Inside Out Group, the specialists in high-risk and challenging filming and time-lapse, covering health and safety videos for rail, construction, and infrastructure projects nationwide.
And we're live. Welcome to this week's Safer Than Your Average podcast. On the show this week, we've got Roger Willie, Managing Director at ACS Risk Group, and also one of the foremost asbestos experts in the UK. Roger, over to you. Do you want to come in and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Blair. Good evening, folks. My name is Roger Willie, and I'm an all-round good egg, and that's all you need to know.
So I don't know if you've seen the show before, Roger, or you've seen the format of the podcast.
No.
We're just going to go straight back to the start. Tell us a bit about your early life, where you grew up, and a bit about your background.
Well, I work at the moment in Govan, so people think I'm from Glasgow, and it'll come as a big surprise to know that I'm not actually from Glasgow at all. I was born and brought up in South Wales, in one of the little mining, well, not so little, in a mining valley called the Rhondda Valley. And that had the biggest concentration of steam coal mines of anywhere in the world. The coal produced there was very high in calorific value, which was great for the navies of the world.
Yeah.
So virtually all the coal was either sent to the Royal Navy or different navies around the world.
Mm-hmm.
A huge concentration of coal mines. And that's where I grew up until I was 18, until I left home. And it was in some ways, a very sad little place, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I lived, we weren't well off at all, anyway. Quite the opposite, really. And we lived in a little street like Coronation Street, back-to-back houses. Our toilet was the bottom of the garden outside, you know.
Yeah.
And we didn't have hot water, we just had cold running water. An old tin bath hanging up outside, and you bathed once a week on a Sunday night. The whole family, you know, in turns.
Yeah.
You had to fill it up with warm water, you boiled on the stove, and that was how I grew up.
Uh-huh.
I lived in Lewis Street, and all the men were coal miners, of course, all of them.
Yeah.
There were 72 houses in Lewis Street. There were 72 families in Lewis Street. There were 72 ladies in Lewis Street, from newlyweds to really quite elderly great grannies. And when I was little, I was brought up by my great grandmother.
Yeah.
And there were no retired men in Lewis Street, none. My dad went down a black hole at 14 years in one day. My two grandfathers went down at 12 years in one day. And my uncles between 12 and 14, depending, you know.
Yeah.
And they're all dead by mid-50s, by late 50s. All of them, every one of them. My dad went down at 14 in one day, and he died at 54. The average male life expectancy in my little village was 55, for God's sake. My dad went a year early, by our standards. By your standards, in Bearsden, you'd expect a white person in Bearsden to live to 82, 84, something like that.
Yeah.
On average, you know. So by your standards, he died 30 odd years too early.
Mm-hmm.
By our standards, a year too early. And that's one hell of a way to grow up.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't be here now because I was destined, because again, we're a very, very poor background.
Mm-hmm.
And no one in my family had ever been to a proper school or university, forget it, you know. Couldn't pronounce the word, let alone go there. And I was supremely lucky because I shouldn't be here now. I should have gone down a black hole and I should have died mid-late 50s. That's what I should have done.
Mm-hmm.
And I was supremely lucky. My parents wouldn't let me go down a black hole, and they put me in for a scholarship exam. And we lived in a very, very poor community. And there was an outstanding boys' grammar school in a few villages down. And they took 60 kids a year, you know, the cream of the cream, you know. And I was lucky enough to win a place at that school. And off I went. I was bussed every day there and bussed back and all the rest of it. And that's how it all started, really. I went to this posh grammar school, and most of the other kids it was a boys' school, 500 boys. It was quite large, you know, for a single-sex school in those days. And most of the boys were sons of doctors, dentists, vets, lawyers, school teachers. And I just didn't fit. I didn't fit at all. I was scruffy, I was rude, I was ill-spoken, and I just didn't fit, and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. And the only thing that kept me there, I was a very good sportsman, I was a very good soccer player, and track athlete. And later on, I ran for Wales and all that stuff, And that's the only thing that kept me there. Otherwise, I'd have left when I was 16, as soon as I could have.
Yeah.
So that kept me there, and supremely lucky, I struck up a great relationship with a games teacher there. And he called me over one day, and he said, he don't call you by your first names in a school like that. He said, Willie, he said, what would you like to do when you grow up? He said, I want to run for Wales, sir. Oh, he said, well, he said, to do that is before athletics clubs, because I'm so old. And he said, to do that, he said, you have to go to university or a teacher's training college. That's the only people who have athletics teams.
Yeah.
He said, how do you do that? And he said, you've got to pass O levels and pass A levels and try an entrance exam. And I said, oh, I can't do that. Can't do that. He said, well, you're not going to run for Wales then. And that was it. That was the great decisions I made. So then he said, what subjects are you going to do? I said, I don't know. I don't like anything except playing football and running. He said, well, it must be something you're good at. And I said, well, physics is pretty easy. Mathematics is pretty easy. French is impossible. History is impossible. English is impossible. He said, all right, boy. He said, go to university and study physics and mathematics. I said, okay, sir. And that was that. And that's how great decisions are made. So off I went to university in Swansea. It had to be a Welsh university, because I wanted to represent the University of Wales. In those days, the university in Swansea was the only one with a proper track, a proper cinder track, And that's where I'm going. And by that time, I'd won a lot of stuff, so I got in quite easily, actually. So that's how it started. So 3 years later, I graduated with a good degree in physics. I didn't really want to leave Swansea, so I stayed on for a PhD in material science, as it happened. And I got a PhD by the time I was just 24, which is quite young, really.
Really early.
Quite young. So then I thought, what the hell am I going to do? I'd always wanted to lecture at university.
Yeah.
I think it's wrong to go to school, go to university, and then stay at university. I think that's wrong. Mm-hmm. I think you should go out and get a proper job, and then go back when you've learned something, which is what I did. So I worked as a material scientist in industry for a couple of years up in Essex, just north of Epping Forest up there. Lovely county, but I didn't enjoy it very much. So then I thought, okay, it's time to move now, perhaps go into academia. And that was the start of the first big jobs crash. There were just no jobs at all. So I was offered 3 jobs, one in Trinity College, which is very prestigious, of course.
Yep.
But it was just the start of the bombings, and my wife had just become pregnant with the first child. So I don't want to go there. And then the next one was King Faisal Air Academy, which I didn't know where it was on a map. Then I got offered an interview in Glasgow, in what is now Glasgow Caledonian, is Glasgow College of Technology then. So I caught a train up to Glasgow. I'd never been to Scotland. I caught a train to Glasgow, and the weather was beautiful. So I had to stay for 2 days, and I hired a little car, and I drove down to Largs.
Yeah.
You go down the big steep hill into Largs.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's called. And there wasn't a cloud in the sky. There was a regatta on, and all these little boats, they sail. So, this is perfect. I'm going to come and live here. If they offer me the job, I'll take it.
Yeah.
And they did. And I thought I would be here for 2 years and then back down south. I wanted to live between sort of Bath, Gloucester, that region, where my daughter lives now, actually. So I came for 2 years, bit of experience, and go down there. And that was over 40 years ago.
It's funny how life turns out sometimes, isn't it?
In some ways, I was very lucky. I came into the college, and it was relatively new. It hadn't been opened that long. And the science department was struggling. The physics department struggled. So I came in, and I was a bright young thing, I suppose. And I started as a lecturer, and I got the first ever government research grant in physics in the whole place. First published papers, the first big international conferences, first patent applications, first PhD students, first of everything really. So they propelled me through the ranks. The principal at that time was a lovely chap, and he was very, very kind to me. Because you could see what I was doing, you know, for the institution.
Yeah.
So I got promoted to senior lecturer, then a reader, and then I was the first personal professor at College of University. And all my work was the backdrop, with other people obviously, but it was the backdrop to it finally becoming a university. Because they had to produce all the evidence, the research work, and publish papers and grants and everything else. And by that time, I was speaking quite regularly at big international conferences all around the world.
Yeah.
So I was very lucky, really, to be in the right place, right time, you know. And when I was doing my PhD, particularly, I became very skilled in X-ray analysis. You give me a chance, I can not now, but then I could X-ray it, tell you what it was, where it came from, everything. And in I can date it precisely, 1977, and it was just before the start of the big asbestos scares. And a guy came up to me. I had a pint on the way home one night. And this guy came up to me. He said, "Are you Roger Willie?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you the X-ray man?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You can X-ray anything and tell me." Yes, I had viewers. Oh, fine. He said, "Can you analyze asbestos?" So I couldn't pronounce the word. The supreme confident, "Yeah, I can do that, no problem." He said, "If I bring somebody to your lab tomorrow, can you analyze it?" And I said, "No, I'm far too busy with all this imported research work." He said, "I'll pay you." I said, "Okay, I'll start tomorrow." Then by that time I had two little girls, you know, on a lecturer's salary, which I was then. I couldn't afford them. So, and that's how it started. And that's how the big adventure started. To analyze it academically, it took me about 2 or 3 days, that's all. But to do it commercially took about 8 or 9 months of really hard research work. I lived in Barhead, south side of Glasgow. First train was 6:15 in the morning. I was on it. And I worked till about 9:30, ended all my lectures about 4. And I worked until the last train, which was 9:15 at night. And I did that every day for about 9 months till we cracked it. And in 1978, I started my little company, and I opened the first private asbestos test house in Scotland. There's 1 or 2 at universities, you know, which weren't plugged in, of course. And that was the first one, and that was the start of the adventure. So I was doing this commercial work, you know, and earning a bit of money and paying quite a lot of money to the university. I paid for equipment, I paid for research students, you know, all sorts of things. And that got a fairly big reputation, really. Simultaneously, I was doing research work, and a fair bit of modern legislation, respiratory protection is all based on my research work. People tell me that's saving about 150 lives a year in the UK. You know, so this year there'll be 150 ladies, early 50s, who have a husband, and they shouldn't. This year there'll be 150 kids, early 20s, who have a dad, and they shouldn't. You know, I'm supremely proud of that. And I did some research work on contaminated land to develop standards for asbestos contaminated land, and those are in use today, still in use today. With all my traveling, of course, and the background like that, I've been invited to go everywhere. So we helped set up the asbestos legislation in America a little bit, in Japan a big bit, in Turkey, and we're currently working in Chile, because they have no regulations at all in Chile. So we're helping those and the government there to set up new regulations, you know. So it's been a great adventure. You know, we've done lots and lots of things, and lots of things on the way through as well. Those are some of the highlights, I guess. But coming through the system, once I got into the asbestos world, I realized that dragged me very, very quickly into health and safety in general, you know. So people know us for being asbestos people. We actually do everything within the company. We have done for 20 years. The company's been 40 years now. But that very quickly dragged me into health and safety. And I started doing other things and course stuff and stuff like that. And then I was invited to come along to branch meetings at IOSH. I wasn't qualified, you know.
Yep.
I didn't have an IOSH certificate or anything. But I did have a PhD and stuff, published papers. So I got invited along, and in those days it was at the College of Building and Printing. And if we were lucky, we'd have about 12 or 15 people, that's all.
Yep.
So there were a few of us, 4 or 5 of us, that clubbed together, ever so hard. And we drove that branch, expanded it hugely. And by the time I finished, I was on the committee for donkey's years. And I finished up, as you know, at the University of Paisley. I was invited over there to run the postgrad department.
Yeah.
I took the whole of IOSH with me. So we had a big building off campus, a big old house, which was a great facility. And we got our numbers up to 50, 60 people some months, you know. It transformed it. And I was delighted when I was invited to speak year before last, I think, at Hampden Park. I came across and spoke at one of the monthly meetings, and there were about 110, 120 people there. It was great to see it. You know, thinking starting with 12 or 15, you know, and getting to a level like that was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, the West of Scotland branch has just gone from strength to strength.
Yeah.
Loads of increase in membership and people coming along to the meetings. It's fantastic.
Yeah. In the early days, the asbestos regs were changing all the time. And I used to put on big one-day conferences, one-day seminars, you know, with the branch, the university and the branch. And we split the proceedings. And we earned a hell of a lot of money for the branch. In those days, you weren't allowed to keep the money. You had to give it back to IOSH in Leicester.
Yeah.
So they built a library down there with Glasgow funds. It didn't please us too much. But in those early days, I very, very quickly realized that there was a paucity of courses, health and safety courses. There's an IOSH certificate course in the College of Building and Printing, and that was it. Nothing else. So I got a couple of people together. Then I started the first ever NIBOSH diploma course in Scotland, and that ran very successfully at what's now the Caledonian. And then that led eventually, after I left, to that health and safety group there, you know. Then I went to Paisley, where I started a postgrad department over there. Didn't have any smelly undergraduates, you know, because I had postgrads there. So we trained people from HSE, from REHIS, from environmental health officers, from SEPA, all sorts. Like great reputation there. And that's when I introduced the first taught MSc program in Scotland in health and safety. And that was very popular as well, very successful. There was a time when MSc graduates couldn't get jobs. And we had about 20 people a year, something like that, and everyone had at least 2 jobs to go to. Everybody.
It's a very well-respected course even now. I've done my undergraduate study at the University of the West of Scotland, which is all on from the University of Paisley. Very well-respected course and a great place to go and study.
Well, all of that, you know, came from the foundations I laid, you know. I got a bit fed up towards the end, and I didn't enjoy where I was working or who I was working with, so I just quit. I reported to the vice principal. So he called me up. He said, "What's this?" He said, "What's this letter?" I said, "I'm going to resign." He said, "Can't do that." It was just before Christmas. He said, "What are you doing for Christmas?" And I said, "I'm going to see my daughter, who's in Australia for a year." He said, "How long are you going for?" I said, "Well, I've only got 2 weeks. So I'm going to Australia for 2 weeks." There's 4 days traveling, of course. He said, "No one goes to Australia for 2 weeks, Roger." He said, "Well, I'm going because I got no time." He said, "Take a month off. I'm not accepting your resignation. Take a month off. I'll come back and we discuss it," which is what I did. And I came back, and he was ever so nice to me. And I said, "Really sorry, but I just have to do something different, you know."
Yeah.
And that's when I more or less quit academia. I kept on doing postgrad courses, teaching on postgrad courses at Strathclyde for donkey's years. I've done for a very long time. But I didn't want to do it full time, you know. So I just do a couple of, about 10 hours a year, that's all. But then I went into the business full time and just grew and grew. So.
Yeah.
And that, as I say, has taken me around the world and very interesting places. I went to Japan. There was no legislation, so I had to meet posh people there, and tell them what we do in Europe. Again, we were very, very lucky because we were the first country to have an industrial revolution. And it was steam driven, of course.
Yeah.
So all early propulsive mechanisms were steam driven. Steam rollers on the road, a classic example. Steamships and early lorries were steam lorries. By the time the Industrial Revolution went to France, Belgium, and everywhere else, Mr. Benz had done his bit. So whereas we were steam driven, they were internal combustion engine driven. So straight away, you see why Britain imported more asbestos than anybody else. Straight away. And then 30, 40 years on, we had the highest incidence of asbestos-related cancers in the world. So we're the first to have that. We're the first to have legislation, the first to have test methods, first of everything, And the whole world has more or less copied us, what we've done. If we find little bits of it, but the legislation everywhere is the same as ours. Test methods the same as ours. So I was in a great position, really, once I started on these big conferences. People would say, well, can you come back and help us, I spent a fair bit of time off and on in Japan. A couple of years ago, I was in Turkey for a while, and USA, of course. At the moment, we're working in Chile. If it wasn't for the COVID thing, I would be out there now.
Yeah.
It took us about a year and a half to set it up. And I went out in November last year for a few weeks, which was quite successful. I met some nice government people, and they're now looking at what we're doing. And because it's not that far from South America, so they were taking advice from North America. And, I don't like their operational methods, really. So we try to persuade them to do what we do in Europe and in the World Health Organization. Why step out of line, when you've got a choice? So that's one of the things I'm doing at the moment. There's a bit of potted history, really, of where I came from.
Yeah, definitely.
And where I've ended up. Just luck all the way. I didn't plan it.
Yeah.
Not at all. Not at all.
It's really interesting, Roger. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the research you've done and how it's made a difference in industry relating to asbestos as well?
Yeah, the first one brought about quite a change, actually. I was out on a demolition site one day, and the guys had the old-fashioned negative pressure masks on, like a World War II gas mask,
Yeah.
I happened to be with the senior Alpi, the senior asbestos inspector from the HSE, senior man to West of Scotland, Headley Gosler. I was talking to Headley, and I got on very well with him. Headley, he said, these face masks, I said, are they any good? Of course they are, Roger, he said. It's a British standard. I said, oh, yes. So I was still at university, so I went back, looked at the standard, and I started to laugh. And then I thought, no, this is quite serious. Because the British standard at Buxton, at the HSE research labs, they had a British standard head cut from stainless steel. So they measured something like 6,000 British heads, took the average, and made one of stainless steel. And I had a hole drilled here and a hole drilled down there. And that was inside a 1 meter perspex cube. So if you wanted to sell the mask, you had to get approval from HSE. So you sent your mask to HSE, they'd strap it on the head, they'd seal everything up, they'd blow a gas in and suck the gas out. Measure concentration coming in, measure what's coming out, divide them, and that's the protection factor. Now, when I saw this, this is ridiculous. I don't have a British standard head. I've got quite an unusual head. British standard head doesn't have facial hair, doesn't have glasses, it doesn't speak, doesn't sweat. And when you see the boys out on site, they sweat profusely.
Yeah.
So there is no relation between that test and what I was looking at out there. No relation. So I got in touch with Italy. I said, look, this is crazy. I said, I'm going to start a little project. So it took us a year to get approval. We had a PhD student to do it. And we had a regular mask, you know, with filter in the front. And we had a tiny filter inside the mask, measuring what the boy's breathing in.
Yeah.
And then we put them at work in asbestos enclosures, and we put a sampler on their collar. So this is a challenge. This is what you're breathing in. Divide them, protection factor. Now the masks at that time, the HSE thought the protection factor was over 300, and we had a value of 6. So they're breathing in 50 times what everyone thought they were breathing in.
Yeah.
So, you know, we wrote that up. It takes ages to get a paper published in the journals. So we wrote it up and sent it to HSE. They were great, very, very quickly indeed, because I said, you know, privately, I said to them, the asbestos removal boys of the 70s and 80s are the mesothelioma victims in the year 2000, which is exactly what's happened. All those chaps I used to know started the first asbestos companies. They're all dead. There's not one of them alive, not one of them. So that was unfortunate prediction that came through, you know. And they realized that. So in very short order indeed, they changed the regs into positive pressure, you know, which is a must now. Of course, you can't work with asbestos without a positive pressure mask.
Yeah.
So negative pressure depends on a perfect seal around here. And you can never get that, of course, ever.
Yeah.
Whereas a positive pressure depends on there not being a proper seal around here. Because if you had a perfect seal around here, the air is pumped in at 3 or 4 times the rate you're breathing. So if there's no exit for it, your head would blow up. You swell up and explode. And you'd have brains on the wall. So that's what happened. So if you take the number of people in the asbestos industry, asbestos strippers, you know, removal boys, and then say you only save 5% or 10% of those a year, that's something like 200 people a year. You know, and it has made huge changes. Huge changes. You've got these younger boys coming through now. When I'm saying younger, perhaps in their 40s, you know, they've been in asbestos industry 20 years, and there's nothing wrong with them. Nothing wrong with them. Whereas their fathers were in the industry before them, they're all dead in their 50s, you know, same as the coal miners. So that was quite a major breakthrough. So yeah, we're very, very proud of that. Very proud of that. And the other one was asbestos in contaminated land.
Yeah, and that's fascinating work, that one, Roger. Can you tell us a little bit of detail about
There
that?
were no rules, Blair. There were no rules, regulations, guidance notes. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. And the first ever major job was at Faslane.
Yeah.
It was a time they were going from the Polaris missile to the Tridents, or vice versa, I can't remember. Polaris to Tridents.
Yeah.
The Tridents are much, much, much bigger. So the boats are much, much, much bigger, twice as long. Huge things.
And just for anyone watching, Fastlane, if you don't know, is a big naval base on the Clyde where the British nuclear attack submarines are located.
Yeah, they got hunter-killers there on the attack submarines as well. And one of them, of course, is always at sea, always.
Yeah.
Top secret naval base. If you drive through Dumbarton, there's signposts, Faslane this way.
Yeah, it featured quite heavily in the news with the nuclear protesters protesting.
That's right, that's right, that's right. So when a decision was made to build the Trident submarines, they're much bigger, and they needed a much bigger facility. So they bought an old shipbreaker's yard next door. So they didn't give it much thought. So the first couple of days, the diggers go in, and all this white stuff comes up out of the ground. It had been used latterly as a shipbreaker's yard. They ripped the asbestos off the boilers, chuck it over the side, you know, and nobody knew what to do. So they said, okay, well, we'll take a skim of about, say, 100 mils, something like that, and we'll test the soil asbestos. Take a skim, test it, take a skim. Now, the analytical technique is so sensitive, you can pick up almost nothing, you know. So every time we tested, we said, there's asbestos there. This went on for a couple of weeks. And each skim is, I don't know, tens of thousands of pounds, you know. I said, wait a minute, stop. This is stupid. I still at university, I had my own labs and some stuff. So I said, what's important is not what's in the ground, it's what's in the air.
Mm-hmm.
So how can I simulate this? So I built a cube and I built a little chimney, stuffed it full of soil with asbestos in, and then it was all computer controlled, and it blew it up in the air.
Mm-hmm.
A controlled environment, and I measured what was in the air. So we can produce a graph of the asbestos in the soil versus the asbestos in the air, you know?
Yep.
From that, you can determine maximum concentration of asbestos in soil, which will give you a value above the trigger concentration of 0.1.
Yep.
And we did that. And then said, well, in practice, it's always above 0.1, for God's sake. So what would happen if you wet the soil? So we did the same experiment, only this time we kept the percentage asbestos the same and added water to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the airborne concentration drops exponentially. It drops by a factor of 100 when you go from dry to about 10% water. So we went back to Fars Lane with all these results pretty quickly, and that's what we did. So we had big water bowsers. They did it in strips at a time,
Yeah.
Water bowsers go in, they make it thoroughly wet, then they go in, dig out the stuff and take it away. Can't tell you where because that's still secret. But that was used a few years later in the next big job in Britain,
Mm-hmm.
which was the big private hospital in Clydebank.
Which used to be an asbestos factory.
It's built on the biggest asbestos tip in Europe, 200 on site.
Yeah. And
So
when
we
that
were
shut
involved.
down, of course, they put the padlocks on the gate and walked away
That's
and
right.
left.
They simply walked away. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was there a couple of weeks after they walked away. It was disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
There was blue asbestos on the floor. There were breeze blocks, and then asbestos cement walls. Top of the
Yep.
breeze blocks, you could run your hand down, and it was like a snowball. And it was blue. It was appalling.
Yeah.
Appalling. So someone came up with the idea. There was an old Victorian big stone dock. They did boreholes, and the volume of the asbestos there was roughly the same as the dry dock.
Mm-hmm.
So the plan was to build a coffer dam, pump all the water out, line it with geotextile membranes, put all the stuff in, geotech membranes over the top, job done. Meter of clean topsoil on top of that, with short root shrubs which go sideways, not down, and to bind it all together.
Yeah.
And by that time, we'd perfected our technique. So we had the job of going down there and supervising the asbestos wood breeding. We had someone there all day, every day for years.
Mm-hmm.
And that was exactly the same. They built a haul road from a contaminated site to the coffer dam area, big hole in the ground. So they worked in strips at right angles to the Clyde. So first thing, the water bowsers would go up and down. We would test it to make sure it's thoroughly wet. Then they'd fill the big boxes. They would go around, dump it into the big hole, and that went on and on and on. So that left behind a clean area, dirty zone. So the clean area, as the days went by, the clean area grew, and clean infill went into that clean area, and the dirty area, of course, got less and less and less, and it vanished into the black hole.
Mm-hmm.
Fine piece of work. It really, really was. And every job in the UK that's been done, major job, is done that way. Every one of them.
Yeah. So
And it all started at nuclear submarine base.
Yeah. Your research led to a change in how jobs were facilitated across the
Yeah,
whole UK.
yeah.
Fascinating, absolutely.
Very gratifying, really. Very gratifying. Yeah. I've enjoyed it.
I can remember being told as a kid about that job in Clydebank. My granddad
Yeah.
worked in the shipyards in Clydebank, and I grew up there.
Yeah.
And he told me the story of the factory closing down and the campaign that the shipyard workers had to try and fight against how much exposure they had.
Yeah.
He himself was exposed as a young man. He was a pipe fitter and was exposed by the laggers that would come along to lag the pipes behind them, and had pleural effusion. Can remember being a kid and staying overnight at my gran and granddad's house and hearing him waking up in the morning and going to the bathroom for 10 minutes to cough his lungs up to try and draw that first breath in. Yeah.
It's horrible.
Horrible, racking cough.
Yeah. Over the years, I've done an awful lot of court cases. I do the expert witness with someone like your dad or your uncle, you know, they've died, somebody's suing somebody, and I do the expert witness bit in the middle.
Yeah.
And I've done about 700 of them now altogether.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, really not nice. Not nice. Because all the early days, they were all shipyard workers, all of them, you know.
Yeah.
It's quite ironic, really. I was surrounded by deaths from silicosis and pneumoconiosis when I was 18.
Mm-hmm.
And all my working life, I've been surrounded by deaths from asbestosis and now by mesothelioma.
Mm-hmm.
It does mean I'm a very well balanced person over there. So I grew up with a big chip on my shoulder, you know. I hate the NCV, hate them. And now I hate CAPE and renewal. So I'm quite well balanced, you know. I'm a bit shorter than I used to be because of the weight,
Yeah.
but I'm very well balanced.
So can you tell us a bit more about your more recent career now, Roger? Take us a bit through the journey and some of the things that you've been involved in more recently.
Oh gosh, that's a hard one. Just because we do so much, you know.
Yeah.
Within the business, I still look after the asbestos side of it, nominally. I don't go out on site or things like that anymore. But we do a lot of asbestos management work.
Mm-hmm.
Even to NHS trust or a local authority or your big clients, you know, and sort out their management systems for them.
Yeah.
We're very heavily involved with that.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have built an overseas presence as well in Turkey and in Chile as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think things are all right. Right. Well, they were all right until lockdown came, of course.
Yeah. And how has that affected you, Roger, and your business?
Oh, disaster.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of our work is with housing associations, and they are very, very, very risk averse.
Uh-huh.
Very risk averse. They just won't let you in. We had a big contract to look at attics, you know, complete stop, complete. There's no people there, for God's sake. You don't see any people, you know. Anyway, it all stopped. So we're quite a small company, we're only 26 or so, but there's 4 of us working full time. That's all. But at least last week was the first of people returning. So hopefully we're going to get people back in the next couple of weeks, you know. But I can't see it coming back to what it was, not within a year or so. I really can't.
And the training side of your business, you've adapted really, really quickly on the training side to be able
We
to offer
did.
online training
Yeah,
rather
we did.
than able in face-to-face talk courses.
Yeah, we did. I developed some e-learning courses in asbestos, fire safety, and Legionella a couple of years ago,
Mm-hmm.
which have done quite well, really. And our asbestos course is used by SEPA. All the frontline inspectors do it, you know, as an example. So we had those on the stocks. And then very quickly indeed, I found out about Zoom and taught myself. And we do quite a lot of courses now by Zoom. I sit on the board of directors of UCATA, you know, asbestos trainers.
Yep.
We moved quite quickly within UCATA for members to allow courses which we normally insisted had to be face-to-face. We eased back a little bit until September, and then we'll review it. And we could do things like asbestos awareness, for example. We could do it like this.
Yeah.
That's been quite successful for us. We've got a whole range of course, health and safety courses and Legionella, all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
Then on top of that, we changed from originally an asbestos company. It was always in my mind to build a risk management company. That's what I always wanted to do.
Yeah.
I happened to start in asbestos risk, but we very quickly went on to chemical risks and stuff, you know, and everything else. And we are a real risk management company now. We really are. So when this COVID thing came along, we saw, oh, we can help people here, you know. It's just a risk assessment at the end of the day. People are terrified of it, but you need to know what it is. It's a virus. How does it get into your body? What does it do to you? And how do you prevent it? It's a classic risk assessment. That's just what it is. So we've built some models and we've been sharing that with housing associations and all sorts of people. So we've actually been very, very busy the past few weeks with people thinking about going back to work, you know, with a bit of evidence of the lockdown weakening a little. I have mixed views of that, of course.
Mhm.
Because if you look at it purely from a medical point of view, you would maintain the lockdown from a physical point of view.
Yeah.
When you look at the mental stress, and of old people who've been on lockdown and they've just gone crazy,
Yeah.
And if you look at the spike in COVID deaths, and there's a much bigger spike in excess deaths. You take deaths on average over the last 10 years in, say, June.
Yeah.
You got this June, and there's a big spike on it. I am sure, I haven't seen any stats, but I'm sure a lot of those are COVID related in the sense that people are in lockdown and they're elderly people and they're going senile before they should be going senile, things like that, So you have to balance all that stuff against the risks of people dying.
Yeah.
And that's such a difficult task,
Uh-huh.
especially when you've got an absolute lack of health and safety professionals and scientists in promoted posts, important posts in the governments.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think that's a huge failing in our current system, huge failing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But people don't appreciate the difference between real risk and perceived risk. And you've heard me speak about that in the asbestos world,
Yeah.
Crazy decisions people make, expensive decisions on the basis of perceived risk.
Mhm.
When you look at the real risk, very, very small indeed.
Yeah.
So it's a balancing act, which is almost impossible balancing act.
Mhm. Very difficult position the government are in as well to make
Hugely
the
difficult.
decisions. Yeah. Yeah.
Hugely difficult. I do have some sympathy for them for perhaps the first time in my life.
So,
Yeah.
a very long and distinguished career, Roger. Really, really interesting things you've been involved in all across your career. What's been your biggest challenge so far?
I tell you, the biggest challenge was when I first came into health and safety.
Mhm.
I was invited in as an outsider,
Mhm.
but I think I earned my invitation over the years. When you think the first diploma course, the first degrees, the first postgrads, and everything else,
Yeah.
But that was a hell of a struggle.
Mhm.
That's the hardest struggle I've had. Because when I came in, I don't want this to sound patronizing because I don't mean it that way at all. But when I first came in, all the most senior, the older health and safety officers had all come in as engineers or did this, did that, did whatever. And they got up to a certain level in the company and they didn't make progress.
Mhm.
And some younger people came behind and they done real good jobs, and managers, directors didn't want to get rid of them. Said, oh, we'll make you a health and safety officer.
Mhm.
And there was no training, there was nothing. They became health and safety officers.
Mhm.
And most of the people I was surrounded with were like that. And it wasn't right because I came from a very structured background.
Mhm.
Physics and mathematics are the hardest degrees you can do.
Yeah.
It's very, very structured, to come from that into this free for all.
Mhm.
And I got to know, well, I started my postgrad department eventually. And I got to know Richard Booth in University of Aston.
Yeah.
And he ran the equivalent down there. And between us, it was our fault in a way that CPD was introduced.
Mhm.
If you played out face, you say, look, we've got to improve people. You've got to improve a pretty low baseline. You've got to improve, got to improve. And that's when CPD was introduced. And that was a hell of a fight to introduce that. We just take, but that was a real struggle. But eventually it's paid off. We now have good courses, we have good people. Not that they were bad people before, but there's a paucity of good training.
Yeah.
Whereas now we have good people coming in for the right reasons and we have good training courses.
Yeah. Definitely.
But
Definitely.
I think all the things I've done, that's got the hardest, I think.
Mhm.
Because it required a complete change of attitude. Complete change. And you know from your job that that's the hardest thing to do, is
Yeah.
change people's attitudes.
Yeah. Let's explore that a little bit, Roger. I know we've spoke in the past and I've seen you present some of your lectures on asbestos. And
Mm.
one of the things that really stood out to me was the part that you told us about the fibre count, the natural exposure that people get, and how
Yeah.
risk averse they are to it. Do you want to talk us through that a little bit, just for the benefit of the viewers?
Yeah, there's the two things really. One of them is the work of Anthony Seaton up at University of Aberdeen. He retired a few years ago, and he's the most wonderful man.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been doing postmortems for years. And some of his early research papers, he came up with a figure of 60% of all people in the UK have asbestos fibres in their lungs at point of death.
Mm-hmm.
In the big city, because you're surrounded by asbestos all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the immediate post-World War II building boom, there was a shortage of stone, shortage of brick, you couldn't get wood, plastics had not been invented. What the hell do you do? You use asbestos, of course. All this stuff left over in the shipyards, the aircraft factories and so on. So you come into the world in a factory, into a hospital, full of asbestos.
Mm-hmm.
You go home to council house, full of asbestos. You go to primary school, full of asbestos. The secondary school, full of asbestos. The college, university, the same. And then you go to a sports centre, a gym, a swimming pool, full of asbestos. You breathe in asbestos all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The car brakes, of course, up until very late 1970s, were always asbestos. So every time a vehicle went past, you breathe in fibres. So consequence of that, of course, his early paper said 60%. He now thinks it's 80 or 90%. But in a large conurbations like the Central Belt in Scotland, London, Manchester, Cardiff, Swansea, it's 100%.
Yeah.
100%. So you've all got them down there. Now, let's be very conservative and say 60%. Be very conservative.
Mm-hmm.
60 million people in the UK, which means 36 million people have asbestos fibres in their lungs at point of death.
Yeah.
36 million of them. Now, if one fibre kills you, I think it's a rather silly statement, wow, it's so dangerous, one fibre kills you. If one fibre kills you, 36 million people would die.
Mm-hmm.
On average, it takes 30 years, anywhere from 15 up to 60, on average with 30 years. So 36 million people would die over 30 years. That's 1.2 million asbestos deaths a year.
Mm-hmm.
How many die? I know it's gone up recently, but it used to be 2,000 a year for 20, 30 years. It's now up at 5,000. It's stabilizing now about 5,000.
Mm-hmm.
So the theory says 1.2 million. Experiment says 5,000. Experiments come from post-mortem studies. If you die from asbestos-related disease, the coroner must inform the HSE. So those figures must be true. 5 million must be true. So 1.2 million must be incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
We've lived in a scientific age for 500 years, since the time of Galileo. Arguably the first ever experiment with his pendulum in his cathedral. So clever people think, they solve equations, they make a prediction. Other clever people think, they build an experiment and they test it.
Mm-hmm.
O-level physics, O-level chemistry, O-level biology, And if the theory and experiment are the same, everything's fine. If they're not the same, one of them's wrong. 1.2, I don't agree. One of them's wrong. The 1.2 million must be wrong because this comes from post-mortem studies. The 1.2 million must be incorrect. How do you arrive at 1.2 million? By thinking one fibre kills you. Now we top and tail that by looking at the work of Professor Gibb. He worked for many years at the Pneumoconiosis Research Centre down just outside Cardiff.
Mm-hmm.
He did postmortems and he counted fibres. So it was one of our cases actually, a lad from Clydebank diagnosed with mesothelioma, medical opinion. 12, 18 months later he dies, postmortem, medical opinion becomes medical fact from the postmortem. So we know the boys died of mesothelioma. We had some of the biopsy material, we sent it to Professor Gibb, he analysed the material, he came back with approximately 110 million fibres in his boy's lung.
Mm-hmm. 110 million
fibres in his boy's lung. So we have a confirmed mesothelioma, 110 million fibres.
Mm-hmm.
And mesothelioma occurs at lower levels than lung cancer and much lower levels than asbestosis.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd expect someone to have lung cancer to have many, many more fibers than that, perhaps 10 times as much. And for asbestosis, about 100 times as much.
Mm-hmm.
You'd expect that. So there's a huge difference, between the real risk and the perceived risk.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, people are spending lots and lots of money, local authorities, housing associations, that they can't really afford in trying to eliminate a risk which is actually minute anyway.
Mm-hmm.
My view changes completely when it comes to the boys who take asbestos off, they rip it off and things like that. Right?
Yeah.
My view changes completely with those. Anyway.
And part of the research for
Anyways.
that as well, Roger, it's
Sorry?
fascinating to me that so many of these guys that remove asbestos are smokers.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've seen in research papers in the past is that because they're a smoker, they're training their lungs to draw the oxygen and the smoke mixture deeper into the lung, and it
Right.
train the fibres to go further in. I've seen
Right.
a couple of papers on that.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
It's very interesting because all that work was done by Selikoff
Yep.
in New York.
Mm-hmm.
He worked in the US shipyards in New York. That's where
Yep.
he worked. So we taught him the equivalent of Clydebank.
Mm-hmm.
So guys, you work in the bows of a ship, and you can't see across the ship. You
Yeah.
can't see a mate 2-3 meters away. Because you're up around 800,000 fibers per mil. That's what you're at.
Mm-hmm.
You can't see across the room. So his experiment, it's not very nice, of course, but you split a cohort. You have normal people, and then you have asbestos workers, and then you have smokers,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have smoking asbestos workers.
Mm-hmm.
Figures for something like every 100,000 people, there'll be 11 deaths from lung cancer.
Yep.
And you take 100,000 people in London, Paris, New York, Sydney, Australia, 11 of them die of lung cancer. We don't know why. Don't know if it's genetic defect or if it's when the chief engineer made us, he got something wrong. But that's what should happen. Now, if you have 100,000 asbestos workers, and these are guys with no protection and you can't see across the room, the 55 goes up to 110, which is twice as dangerous. So clearly, we need to protect these guys.
Mm-hmm.
If you take 100,000 asbestos smokers, it increases, I can't remember the exact figure now, it goes up to something like 130, something like that. And it's 3 times more dangerous to smoke than it is to work with asbestos.
Mm-hmm.
And the real nasty one, if you're a smoking asbestos worker, the death rate goes up to over 600. And it should be 12, 13. It's 55 times as much.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got these draconian asbestos regulations, not really for asbestos workers, because it's nearly twice as dangerous to smoke. We've got them because of lunatics called smoking asbestos workers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's where it comes from. Yeah.
Really interesting work, Roger, and a career spent trying to save people. Your research is factored into saving 150 people a year, as we said at the outset. That's absolutely mind-blowing to me.
I didn't realize that I worked so hard. Even now, I'm an old guy now. But even now, I never work less than 50 hours a week. That's what I do. And I just accept that's what I've always done since young boy. And someone asked me 2, 3, 4 years ago, why do you do it? You don't have to do it anymore. Why do you do it? And instantly, my mind went back to Lewis Street,
Mm-hmm.
to the beginning. And walking behind these crippled old guys, bent over, coughing and spitting. I've always been a nosy boy. I've got to have a look, and you see the spitting on the pavement. A bright red gout in the middle, cherry red blood, fresh from it. And I was surrounded by that when I was 18.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't plan it, I was just so lucky. And I found myself in a position I could change that. I can do something, change it. And I have.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to die tomorrow. If I had to die tomorrow, I wouldn't have any regrets.
Yeah.
There's nothing I can look back on and say, oh, I wish I'd done that. Because I always did it. Mostly it was disastrous, you know, lose a lot of money or whatever, you know, lose a wife along the way, you know, things like that. I don't regret any of it. I really don't.
So that probably brings us nicely on to talk about then, Roger. What advice would you give to someone starting out in health and safety today?
Oh gosh, that is so difficult. That is so difficult. I think health and safety is very, very, very complex. And I'm a scientist, by training, you know, so I approach everything in a scientific manner. And I think that has helped enormously, enormously right through my life. Wherever I look at, you know, I bring these railway track to it, you know, and I think down a railway track. And people who don't do very good courses may be very good at other things. I'm thinking of social scientists, for example, you know, and they're very good at what they do. I'm not quite sure what that is, but they must be good. But I think on tram lines, you know, and it takes me to a solution. So I think what I'm trying to say is that I think all health and safety courses should really have a strong physical science input, bit of chemistry, a bit of physics, a little bit of biology, a bit of virology now, you know, healthy dose of mathematics. So my advice would be to dig out somewhere a course like that, as opposed to going to some airy-fairy course somewhere, you know. Because we see it from both ends. You know, I saw it at the university end, and we now employ these people. And you do see the failings in the system, I'm afraid.
I can remember being at university and having to study the science side of things. I wasn't very academical when I left school, and I went back to university later in life to get that higher level qualification in health and safety and help my career progress.
Yeah.
I remember going in to do the science modules, analytical measuring, and I kicked it, screamed and I howled, I'll never use this in industry. And I got my first job in health and safety. The first day I started, I went into the office and I sat down, and one of the facilities management health and safety team that sat across from me was sitting over a computer looking a bit puzzled and scratching her head. And I said, what's wrong? And she said, you know, we're working in this school that we're facilities managing, and we've got this swimming pool, and we've put too much chlorine in it, and we need to work out how much water to put in to dilute it down. And I'd just, of course,
and you said, bang!
Module and got a big piece of flip chart paper, and I'm on a temporary contract at this time. I get this big piece of flip chart paper and I write longhand the equation out, and write it all down for her, and I say, right, there's your dilution, that's how much water to put into the swimming pool. And they're looking at me as if I've vanished from Mars. And they said, that's absolutely brilliant. You know, and I had to phone the head lecturer up a couple of weeks later. I phoned him up and I said, look, I'm on a temporary contract here. They've offered me a full-time job. I think that's really impressed them. Thank you very much for putting up with me when I moaned and kicked and screamed about this.
Yeah, I know exactly who you're referring to.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that proves my point, you know, especially these days, because so few people do science, so people are so terrible at mathematics.
Yeah.
And everyone makes fun of people who do science or engineering and mathematics, you know. So a little bit of knowledge goes an awful long way in our business. A long, long way. Yeah. There we go.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Roger. It's been brilliant to have you on. If anybody wants any asbestos consultancy advice or to come on any of your training courses, I'll put the links up for your website.
Yeah, that'd be great.
When we get set up from there. And thank you on the behalf of the Safer Than Your Average listeners. I know there'll be a lot of people fascinated with this presentation.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been an absolute pleasure, a real pleasure.
This podcast is sponsored by Inside Out Group, the specialists in high-risk and challenging filming and time-lapse, covering health and safety videos for rail, construction, and infrastructure projects nationwide.